Anna, seems like we have you on the call.
Right here.
Hey, how are you?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
I was trying to get into my own meeting. It seems like, like a Google link and a Zoom link, and you can imagine whatever can happen with the remote first world. Is Hugo here as well? I think so.
Hi, Apoorv. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well. It's Friday here, so there's nothing to complain about.
Yeah, it's early morning for you, right?
It's 9 a.m., so it's the perfect time to express some form of clarity, I think.
You're hopefully your first meeting in the day.
It is not my first meeting, unfortunately. Yeah. Nor is it my last.
We'll just give a few minutes for everyone to join, and then we can kick it off.
Sounds great.
But I realized actually the Eventbrite actually is 12 p.m. So some people actually even joined at noon, and had to tell them that, hey, please come at 4. So
hey, Tim.
We'll sort this out. Here we go. Good to see you.
Likewise. Thanks for putting this on as well, both of you and everyone.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
And sure, yeah. Is Annie here too, or Anna here as well?
I wonder, would it be too much to ask people who are here already, maybe to just say who you are in the chat, what you do and why you're interested in community building or something like that? If you're interested, no pressure. But I suppose the point is there are so many reasons to want to build communities, and it'd be great to speak to, more of what you're particularly interested in.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And please don't say your VCs told you to. That was only half a joke.
It's a good one.
Appreciate it.
I was going to suggest for whoever is in the audience, as and when you come up with questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We have like few questions to start off for inspiration, but it's your forum, so feel free to ask questions as and when they come up, and I'll bring them up during the conversation. So yeah, I think we can kick it off. We'll let people join as and when they come, but. Anna, Hugo, thank you for taking the time. I think this topic of like building dev and data communities is top of mind for a lot of people, hopefully for the right reasons and not because VCs are telling them, as Hugo pointed out. But before we
it's not a bad reason.
But before we start, maybe I think folks know like what your like current roles are and what you're leading in your current roles, but it'll be helpful to get a little bit of background before like your current roles and what you were doing. So maybe we can start with Anna, and then we hop over to Hugo.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. So I am now at DBT Labs, and I run the community and data teams there. And that is pretty much a summary of most of my life. It was either community or data or something in between. I once upon a time got a PhD in all things community for open source software in particular. And I spent a lot of time studying conflict in communities and trying to think about ways of designing better communities that are healthier and more inviting and engaging. And somewhere in between, I did a lot of data stuff at GitHub, and eventually fell into running the first analytics engineering team, which is what brought me to DBT Labs. And the reason I now run both community and data is because they're kind of the same people in our world, in the community that me and my team manage. Hugo?
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Your graduate studies sound fascinating, Anna. I'd actually love to pick your brain about that at some point. So I work as head of DevRel, which is a form of community building. DevRel community and Evangelism have an interesting Venn diagram of sorts. So we're working on machine learning infrastructure. Prior to that, I was doing similar things with more of a focus on the building the marketing engine as well at a company called Coiled, which are essentially is scalable compute as a service. So Dask as a service, if you know the PyData stack, Dask is, sorry, I'm about to go on a marketing spiel for Dask. Dask is a way to scale out a lot of your PyData computation. If you're interested, definitely check it out. These two companies are quite interesting, and I'll go into this a bit more later. Community building around a pre-existing, very let's say relatively strongly adopted open source package allows one to bootstrap community building in an interesting way, which we don't necessarily have currently at Outerbounds. Going back a bit further, I worked in online education for data science for some time at a company called Data Camp, and I did a lot of curriculum development, internal data science, and DevRel stuff there as well. And there are some key points there about the type of community building efforts that we saw work. One thing to kind of forewarn there is we're going to talk about measurement at some point. And one of the jokes here is that some of the best community building initiatives you'll never be able to measure. So we'll definitely get to that. But there are other ways to think about it. Measurement is not the be all and end all, right?
Spoilers.
Sorry?
Spoilers.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a trailer. Before that, and this is quite important for this conversation, I think. I worked in basic science research, so I call myself either a retired or reformed scientist. And this actually is really important to me because it speaks to all the reasons I do community building, essentially. Working in basic science research in biology and physics, so the physics of the cell, essentially. I worked with some of the most brilliant people I've ever met who couldn't do their work because they did not have the computational skills to do it. So I really want to make sure that, you know, the millions of existing, tens of millions of existing and aspiring scientists have access to tools, community, education, research, and processes and workflows so that they can do their work as easily as possible. And one way to view it is as cybernetics in a lot of ways, I think, to how we get the machines, how we become the controller, right? And get machines doing what they're good at while, you know, we're doing what we're good at, which for scientists doesn't involve configuring Kubernetes clusters, for example. So that's kind of a bit of my background that's relevant, I think.
Thank you so much, Hugo. And I think you said a couple of things which we'll definitely unpack later, including kind of the terms around community, DevRel, evangelism, because I think there's a lot of confusion around those terms as well. But before we get there, I think the core question, or the kind of the fundamental question is like, when you think of community till now, a lot of community kind of is very synonymous with open source. Like a lot of open source companies or projects that come up like end up like having communities around their projects, and like community should not be limited to, or is not limited to, open source. And there is definitely a motivation around building a community and owning a community. And as a data or a dev focused founder, I think the more fundamental question, like I think we believe everyone should be asking, is like, why should we build a community? Why should we own a community? Why should we grow a community? And it starts with the DNA of the founders and the founding team itself. So would love to understand from your experiences and examples. Maybe we can start with Anna, and just to like help unpack maybe how should founders approach this question of like, why should you build a community and for what purpose?
Yeah, well, I will start by asking my favorite question, which I ask to everyone I work with, which is, what problem are you trying to solve? And I think that really determines the kind of community that you can and should build. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the different ways I've seen that manifest in my experience and in my career. You may be building a company on top of something that's open source, and you may want to have people contribute to your project, and you may want to have people contributing code, you may want to have people contributing documentation, but is that the thing that you need in order to scale your business? Is the question to ask yourself, because it isn't always the case that that is the right thing for the problem that you're trying to solve and for the thing that you're trying to build. And also, who is your target audience for the thing that you are building and for the problem that you're trying to solve? How capable are they of contributing to some of the things that you are already developing? Is it even feasible to find someone in your growing community who might contribute a pull request back to your project? So in the case of the community that I'm now a part of and help to steward, we're a tool that enables data developers to work more efficiently. Most data developers are not software engineers, but we're building software that encourages them to adopt software engineering best practices. As a result, I don't expect the majority of the people in the community to be able to just open a pull request to our core open source project and say, oh, like, I really want to fix this thing. But the amazing thing about the community that we do have is that it is full of people who are sharing knowledge with each other for the first time about how to do data in a different way. And that's kind of what we say when we mean analytics engineering. It's like, it's really using software engineering best practices to do data work. And so what ours is a community of practice. And I use that word a lot internally in the company. And I think about this all the time and remind myself that the reason that this community exists is not for us, is not for the benefit of the company or the product. It is there for the benefit of the humans who are sharing knowledge with each other, who are all adopting new workflows together. They're figuring out a lot of this for the first time in their organizations. And it is their support network. It is their knowledge base. It is it is their launching point for new ideas. It's probably where a lot of new ideas in the industry are happening. And so for us, that is incredibly values aligned with how the founders think about this. But it was also very natural that it evolved that way, because the open source project came first and the company came relatively much later, several years later. And so it's really important to remember like why you're doing the thing. Hugo?
Yeah, I actually have a question for you. I love the idea of a community of practice. And I definitively think you're absolutely right that the community is you're building it so that practitioners can get access to what they need to do their jobs, right? And remove blockers as soon as possible. I do think, though, it is also aligned with the business needs of the company, right? Because the company wouldn't invest in such a thing otherwise. So there's almost, we are talking about like company community fit of some sort. That's a horrible term. I apologize for using it, but it's a stretch analogy, I think. Yeah.
I love that framing. One of the company values is profits are exhaust. And that's kind of what we think about when we talk about how we engage with community. It means that if we add value to this group of humans who are learning how to develop data in a different way, in a more effective way, learn to collaborate better together, then good outcomes will happen for the company. Yep. And an example of that is if you support and nurture your community, if you are investing in folks' personal development, if you're helping them grow in adopting these workflows, you're helping them get better jobs, you're helping them advance in their career, you're helping them get more visibility, write blog posts, give talks, all of that comes back many, many fold, because what you're doing is you're building champions for an entire like new way of working. And every new person that they interact with and every new person that they meet will be reached by them you will reach them through them indirectly.
Yep, absolutely.
And so that's what profits are exhaust means to me, or how I interpret that company value.
That's great. In terms of reasons, I think I always ask people Anna asked the question, what problem are you trying to solve, which I love. I also ask the question, what are your business goals? And how can community feed into that, right? So I'll try to give some non-controversial examples. I think at the moment, Databricks, for example, doesn't, I don't think, need to do some serious community building efforts, right? Their motion is incredibly top down. And at some points it was partially bottom up, but not in the way that a company like Twilio was, right? The type of bottom up developer motion that Twilio had, and solving real concrete problems of developers, right? And generating a huge amount of content for them, but giving them the infrastructure to generate their own content, to then follow that by a top-down motion, I think is incredibly important. And that's what we're seeing a lot in the open source space now, and the productization of open source. So
just a question to that, Hugo. Like, I think that's a great point. And I think just to break it down, like in terms of trade-offs, right? When I think if you have a open source community and you're starting a company around it, then kind of it's a no-brainer that you already have a community around a project, and you are trying to build a product that sells to the organization or to a team that is outcomes based, because the community is kind of benefiting from a framework which is more for the individual, and helps the individual itself. But if you're not an open source company, and if you have certain pain points in mind, to Anna's point, right, which is you have a pain point in mind, you have the audience in mind, and the questions in front of you are like threefold, right? Either you're like, I'm investing in all my time and effort because bandwidth is all that I have today, because there are very few people in the company. I'm investing all my bandwidth in building a community, in building like practitioners who would love the idea of discussing things around this topic. The second way of going about it is I work with like few design partners who I like work top down, and I figure out like what to build. And then I'll figure out whether I want to sell it top down or whether I want to like build a freemium product and then see if the freemium product takes up or not, or takes off or not. Definitely on the latter two, there's obviously more immediate kind of returns where you're actually seeing like people that you're engaging with from a commercial point of view or top-down point of view or even freemium point of view might end up being like real users or real buyers of your technology, but there's more investment that has to happen on the community side. But again, like that might reap like even more returns in the future. So I think those are the kind of the trade-offs that a lot of people do get stuck in when they're starting out, if they're not open source.
That makes sense. And something you've really nicely identified in there implicitly is community as a spectrum, right? It isn't community or no community. You can start organizing meetups and see what happens. And of course, as we know, for early stage startups, quickly experimenting and then seeing and iterating on successful experiments is incredibly important, right? You can start your efforts to build a community on Slack in parallel with that, but maybe not invest in a whole DevRel or community function immediately, I think. So figuring out how that works, I think, is incredibly important. I love the question around what if you don't have open source, because I've worked with several companies and know many others that don't have an open source offering, and they either have or are strongly considering building an open source offering in order to community build. And that type of reverse engineering, I think, is the opposite of what Anna was speaking to, that happened at DBT, right? And I think the goals there need to be very clear, because if you're reverse engineering something like that and you're not quite certain what you're trying to get out of it, I think you do need to be very careful there.
Makes sense.
But I do think, particularly in the data space, there is, in the data tooling space, which, as we know, is incredibly crowded and perhaps will get more so in the short term, there is some form of like Wild Westiness where people are trying to find some grounding, some footing, and community building isn't in there to try and test hypotheses. If you have access to a community that trusts you, right, and you have a lot of credibility with them, they'll do a lot of things for your company, whether it's they'll come and, just road test the product whenever you have new releases or something like that. They'll also go out to bat for you. So something we discussed earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, and maybe we'll get to this. I think one measurement of community is the number of people who go out to defend your company in public and go out to bat for you. Now, you maybe don't want to test whether people will actually have to do that, but you get a sense of that. I do think another company that did this very well until somewhat recently is Rome Research. And I joked about this with you, Apoorv, that they had a user-generated hashtag Rome cult, where people were sharing all the things they did with Rome Research. I do not suggest anyone try to have a hashtag which has the word cult in it. I think that is probably a really bad idea. But I do think that is a signal that you've done some strong community building when you have people out there who will go out to bat for you, so to speak.
That makes sense. I think passion, pain points, and skills kind of unite people in different ways and forms. And obviously, passion is the underlying thing around in this. And if, like to Anna's point, if you're building or kind of helping build a community to empower practitioners who are passionate about a certain field, where your product is just one of the toolkits in their spectrum of things that they're using, I think that's a great way to kind of frame it. I think moving on to the next piece of it, which is kind of once you identify like why you're building the community, I think, and just focusing on kind of the 0 to 1 part of it, because there's so many phases of community building. And so let's chat about the first part of it. Like now that you've identified that as an open source company, you might have a small community, or as a non-open source company, you want to build a community. How do you see those efforts? Like, what do you start doing? Because I think it's, for a lot of folks, it's a black box. Like literally, like what should the first few steps be in terms of like, should they be writing content? Should they be like, what kind of channels they should be tapping into? And there is a aspect of like category creation versus like building a better tool than existing tools out there. So I'd love to get like some thoughts around like that aspect as well. What have you seen in terms of successful community creation? And what examples come to mind? And I would love to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. The thing that comes to mind for me is related to something you said earlier, Apoorv, which is when do you start hiring for your DevRel team? And the thing that I would say is resist the temptation to like put community into a bucket and let just someone run it in a corner, especially at the very beginning. Like you want to know everybody's names. You want to know what they're doing. You want to know what their problems are. You want to see their faces on a regular basis, and you want them really involved in shaping the thing that you're building. And that is probably the first priority if you're really, really early in your development, because what that's giving you is a really tight feedback loop for market fit. It's giving you a tight feedback loop for the types of things that resonate, use cases, what have you. And it's also buying a tremendous amount of goodwill and excitement for the thing that you're doing in a very organic and sort of win-win way. And what you'll see happen if you do this well is that you will have people writing content for you. You will have people getting really excited and like, hey, can I build an extension? Or like, hey, can I like write this documentation? Or like, hey, can I translate this into Japanese? Like, what have you? And that's where the magic is in the fact that you can kind of scale really quickly without needing to think about what a channel is. So that's like 0 to 1, right? Especially the 0. Everyone should be thinking about community, at least in my opinion. Everyone should be thinking about community. Everyone should know. Everyone you're working with who's building the thing should know who everyone is.
And what kind of forums have you found helpful in your kind of early days in any of those efforts? Have they been events? Have they been like any online communities or content channels? Like what would you recommend?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on the shape of the community that exists, because there's another thing that happens, right? It's community boundaries are very fuzzy. Mm-hmm. And so you're not building your community, you're kind of coalescing a group of people around you that are part of other communities. And so where do those people live? What are the things that they're most familiar with? Things that are common in the technology space. Most people are on meetup.com. And so as soon as you post a meetup in an area that has like an interesting title, people sign up even before you've scheduled an event. Like that's the cool thing about Meetup. As soon as you create a Slack channel, like you will have people hanging out in there, or maybe discourse, right? Or sorry, Discord. Discourse is something else. And it, like, you need to know where people already are to make it really easy for them to talk to you, because it's more about them.
Yep, makes sense. Hugo, you've also seen like multiple communities and created multiple of them. Like, what have you observed? Like, what channels work, and like, how do you seed a community at the early inception stages?
Yeah, so I think it's a function of where you want to get, where you are, and then trying to figure out, there's path dependency there as well, right? So I do want to speak to Anna's point, which I really love, of making sure that you have a culture of community internally. There's a challenge that I've encountered a lot, which is some of the best engineers seem to me totally disinterested in any form of community, but they're people who build like wicked product essentially, and I want to ship it. So making sure that they're aware, but making sure that you're not creating too much friction for them. I think I can't decouple this from DevRel culture as well, which I think internally is incredibly important. What I mean by that is, as head of DevRel, me or anyone on my team is not the best person to write release notes for something we're shipping. It's the person who's shipping it, right? So a huge part of my job, in order to get people internally to interact with the community, is lowering the barrier to entry for everyone internally. And so making sure there are small enough at an early stage processes in place, but being able to, you know, leverage all the tools we have. So one thing I do, for example, with some of our engineers is I'll just sit down with them on a call and they'll brain dump everything, and then I'll put some form to it and we'll iterate on it back and forth, and then that will form release notes, for example. So I think that making sure that everyone internally is on board. Speaking to Anna's point there, what channels? And seeding a community. I'm sorry, I do want to speak to seeding a community first. What other communities already exist that you can, let's say, harness or exploit, to maybe use a pejorative there, but I do mean that. So for example, I'm working on a machine learning infrastructure framework currently, right? So there's a question, if someone became a Kaggle grandmaster using this framework, that's something which could help seed a community, right? Kaggle already has a big community. If people teaching scikit-learn tutorials decided to have a section at the end on productizing scikit-learn models and use Metaflow, which I'm working on, that would be a very interesting way to seed this community. So I think the first point to make there is that there are a lot of pre-existing communities that you can potentially harness. Once again, all of this is experimental though. There's no silver bullet here, right? So I encourage everyone to experiment with pre-existing communities. Also, for better or for worse, doing events with people who are well established. When I started a podcast many years ago, when I was at Data Camp, I've been back in Australia for some time, so I interchange data and data constantly now. So I want to apologize for that up front. But we decided to make sure our first guest was Hilary Mason on the podcast. Our second was Chris Valinsky, who was running big data at AT&T then. Then Dave Robinson, who was the first hire at Stack Overflow on the data science team. And getting high profile people, if possible, and allowing them to share the cool stuff you co-create with them, I think is incredibly important. So to specific channels, once again, it depends what your goals are, but I think a lot of the time you do want many-to-many interaction. You don't necessarily just want to be in broadcast mode where you're telling people things and getting things back in isolated channels. What I'm doing currently at the moment is we want to make sure that there's a community that can help each other, right? And Slack is a perfect place for that, as is Discord in a variety of ways. But if you can somehow create that form of many-to-many community where we've got a situation where people ask questions and now other Metaflow users will jump in and answer it for them, right? And I mean, similar things happen at DBT. I also think I'm so impressed by DBT, the fact that, you know, every day I hear people use the term DBT engineer, and I'm like, that is absolute gold, right?
Yeah. I think that's also a very interesting example, because like DBT kind of has created a category of its own versus like in a lot of cases, like tools find a different approach to doing things and doing things 10x better, hopefully. But do you think that there's anything different that you would do for creating a category versus like, and obviously with like doing things 10x better, you already have existing communities to leverage heavily, because you have existing people using those tools and you really want to disrupt the way they are trying to do things. But like, what if you're creating a category like DBT, which doesn't happen every day, and not every tool becomes a part of the commonly used language within the stack? How do you approach that problem?
I actually have a strong opinion here, which is so my opinion is that, especially in the very crowded wild west of ML ops, people are craving a coherent worldview. It's worse than an absolute mess currently. And I think what DBT did was create a practical worldview that removed a lot of paper cuts and unblocked all the crap that people have to do. And let's be clear, at the moment in the space, people are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to like keep like figuring out configuration files and setting up like SageMaker endpoints and that type of stuff. Huge cost to the company, a lot of money, right? And a lot of bandwidth of scientists. So what DBT has done was, you know, remove a lot of those barriers and create a community through a shared worldview. And then that allows categories to arise. So I think that's partially what different parts of the space. And I don't think necessarily experiment trackers or feature stores or metric stores are the answer. I think we need some far broader type of worldview. I think Elon Musk is probably the best example. We want something different from, like, he creates worldviews, and I think that may be a devoid of content. I'm still not sure about that guy, right? But we do, I think he definitely creates these bold visions, which people will get on the rocket ship for. And as a company, that's one of the biggest things you can do, I think.
The literal rocket ship.
Yeah, exactly. With a car in it playing Bowie or whatever he did, right?
That was a good point. And I think while we were talking about DBT, Anna, you have like so many like newer tools that are creating sub-channels within DBT now, which kind of leverage the DBT community. At the same time, they're doing something which is not competitive at all. Could you talk a bit about, or could be competitive in the future, but could you talk a bit about like how that works and how do you guys think about it?
Yeah. I want to say, Hugo, that the point you made earlier about you're not setting out to build a category, you are solving a problem, and your community ends up building that category for you. Right? That's spot on. Totally. And that speaks to right now where DBT as a technology is at with the community. It has become a standard in the way that people operate. The thing that's happening in the modern data stack right now is there's all these different tools that are integrating with each other and building on top of DBT. And all of that is amazing. That is a bunch of, that creates a lot of good choice. What you don't want to do is be in 50 different Slack channels at the same time in order to talk to all of the different people who are creating that. And so what we do instead is we invite those people in to the community with us, because it is a benefit to the existing community. It allows people to see, hey, cool, there's a new thing here, and people care about it. Like right now, everybody's excited about DuckDB. And it also enables the team that's behind that technology to hang out with existing users, potentially new users, and it has become a really valuable gathering place. And so at this point, we're thinking less about creating and it was never a DBT space. It's a space for analytics engineering conversation. And so it's a space where people can freely talk about like, this tool is better than this tool, or like, I use this for this, and, you know, why for that. And, you know, pretty often criticism of DBT as well. And that's amazing. Every time someone says something that's like really good feedback, just like send them swag. We're like, thank you for sending us criticism. But that's kind of the space that we wanted to create. And I think that is what is the right thing for the ecosystem at the time. And that's the important thing. That's what the users need. That's what people need from us.
Makes sense. Now back to your favorite topic, which is measurement, which we will.
Could I add one thing to something Anna just said? The unreasonable success of sending swag to people is something that may seem silly, but it still boggles my mind how much people just love being sent swag, and they'll post on LinkedIn and Twitter and all of that and get lots of likes and lots of engagement. So get some nice swag and send it to people.
Some nice swag.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Underline the nice, like it needs to be meaningful. It needs to last, because, you know, in 5 years, you might be this amazing rocket ship company and people are going to be so proud to wear that OG t-shirt.
Yeah. And think outside the box. I mean, maybe you want to, I don't know whether you've done this at DBT actually, but, you know, create a new type of Monopoly board, like send a game to someone that's analytics Monopoly or something like that. I mean, that may be ridiculous, that example, but.
It's not a ridiculous example. A couple of folks in the ecosystem have done that. Someone built a Jenga tower, which is like the representation of the modern data stack. Someone built a card stacking game. It's amazing. Like,
I love Jenga because it does. I mean, this whole space feels like Jenga way too much. Yeah,
exactly.
Time, right? Like I'm scared.
With so much creativity going into like obviously engaging the community and growing the community with all whatever you mentioned right now, and like obviously so much energy and sweat going into it, I think the obvious question is like how do you measure impact? And I'm sure like you guys are thinking about it all the time. How are you doing it in your current roles? And I know that it's different stages for both. Like for DBT, it's a different stage, but it would be helpful to learn like what should be the foundational elements that DBT should have cared about in the past, and now what it cares about today, so that people can have that in the foundational elements. And even for Outerbound or for Dask, like what were the key things that you measured, Hugo? And so maybe this time we can start with Hugo, and then we can move to Anna.
I think it's very important to identify what you can measure and also what these things mean. Okay, so I'll give an example of, I presume a lot of people who work in open source use GitHub stars to track something, right? Now, is that an important metric? Maybe, but think about what it really means is key. So I think a lot of people people know that GitHub stars is a bad proxy for something, but I think too many people think of it in terms of community size. I would urge you absolutely against this. What I actually think GitHub stars is best interpreted as, even with error bars here, is brand awareness of the open source package, right? So for example, when you publish a blog post on Towards Data Science or something trends somewhere and you do see GitHub stars go up, does that mean a few more people join Slack? Maybe. Does it mean your community is growing? I don't necessarily think so. I think thinking about your funnel or constellation of users and flows between these different parts. So really top of funnel brand awareness. GitHub stars can help you there. But as you drill down into the funnel or closer to this center of gravity of your community, thinking about real interactions is really important. You can of course look at all metrics on your channels, Twitter, if you're doing live streams, how many people turn up there, how many people watch it afterwards, website landings, engagement on your website, this type of stuff. But really thinking about what your goals are and what numbers mean what. So I mentioned before, if you actually want to build a community that helps each other, maybe you should start looking at how many non-employees or non-maintainers of your package respond to questions on your many-to-many channel, whether it's Discord or Slack, right? So these are kind of a few heuristics and rules of thumb there. I would urge you against this is kind of a joke as well, but I'd urge you against like total number of people on Slack, because in the end, they'll mostly be VCs. So that was the joke. But well, exactly. Which is all, but in all honesty, Slack is such a wonderful space to see people interacting, and you can get far more robust metrics out of Slack than we have on any other channels before. One thing to watch out for here, though, is Slack fatigue more generally, because when I think about the Outerbound Slack channel, some of the time I forget that it's one of many in this left-hand pane in Slack, which has red everywhere, right? So remembering kind of what people's experience is there. And on top of that, I think at this early stage for Outer Bounds, it was different at Coiled, thinking about Dask, but also thinking about how many community members even want to generate content for you. We've started a blog recently, right? And there are a whole bunch of people who are like, hey, we've used Metaflow for this. Can we write a blog? You know, and that type of stuff. And making sure that you're trending in that direction. And recognizing that incentivizes the right behavior as well. If I want more people to write blogs, that's an incentive for me to go out and be a presence in the community to make sure that there's good vibes, essentially. So I think these are a few rules of thumb and certain metrics. There are a lot of others you can think about as well. I do want to say, though, as I said, when I was at Data Camp, we launched a podcast which took off, and it was clearly the best marketing effort we'd ever done. That much was obvious. But how to measure that and how to think about ROI there, totally unclear. Totally unclear. So measuring is very important, but there are certain, like, and in all honesty, if you're sending pizzas to meetups and that type of stuff, do you really want to start measuring like the impact of that? Like, you know that it costs you like some change, and you know that it's doing good things. So there are certain things that you don't want to measure, but the other types of things you do, including how many people you're bringing in, engagement, and measuring their interactions as well.
Super helpful, like great to know like what not to do, and also like the insight around like how employees are interacting beyond the key contributors is kind of a very interesting metric. Anna, what have you observed and what do you measure?
I want to talk about two things to this audience. One is figuring out what your flywheel is and what your what are the types of things that you most want to optimize for in the community that you're building. And then the second is time horizons. So as an example, in the DBT community, we talked earlier that about how it's a community of practice. And so what we want to do is we want people to share knowledge with each other. And sharing knowledge means different things at different stages of your familiarity with the tool. And it means different things at your different skill levels at analytics engineering. And so understanding how the thing that you're driving connects to the thing that people are doing with your technology, with the thing that you're building is really, really important. I would expect, for example, that someone who is starting out hacking with the command line version of DBT might find a couple of bugs or might find a couple of things that are not clear in the documentation, and they will open up a PR and fix it. That's an easy thing for them to do. If you make the barrier, again, to Hugo's point earlier, if you make the barrier to entry really, really low, people will do that. And we actually see tons of first-time contributors to GitHub in our documentation. But you can't expect that person to turn around and write a blog post in a couple of weeks. And that's where we get into timelines. So how complicated is it to learn the thing that you're building? How much time does it take to become successful with it? How much time does it take to become an expert in it and be able to advocate about the thing to other people? And the thing that I think is really hard to measure when it comes to community, when it comes to DevRel efforts, are those things that are that longer time horizon, because the return is not immediate. it's like you're thinking 12, 18, sometimes years into the future. One example that I often think about is the investments that GitHub as a company made into the open source community, into building a developer community. I started out in that community maybe 2011, 2012, and GitHub was everywhere. There were stickers in every event around the world. You could sign up and get literal cash to run your hackathon. If you were a student, like anywhere in the world, there was tons of free stuff available to you. Those investments that are like 10 years ago are still paying dividends today. They're really, really hard to measure, but they're incredibly powerful. And so the thing that you can do in order to show value and in order to understand for yourself, like what those investments will turn into, is tell stories. Like think about talking to people, think about capturing the impact that this is making, and don't be afraid to think of measurement as a qualitative thing as well. Like user stories are incredibly powerful, and the more of those you collect over time, the richer your understanding is of what people are doing and what they care about, and the easier it is for you to point to something and say, yeah, this is the value of the thing that we did way back.
That's super interesting. I think it's great to hear kind of from both the metrics as well as kind of some tactical advice as to what you should do to actually measure things. And I'm sure like folks in the audience kind of appreciate that part. I think so one thing linked to this, which is what kind of kicks in like maybe in the medium to long term in a company which is building a community, is figuring out how to measure the impact, not just in terms of like how happy the community is, but if you're building a business around it, is to figure out like how to translate the bottoms up motion into a top down motion in some way or form. I think one way is to kind of wait for like inbounds to come, but the second is to assess like what would be the right kind of organizations to reach out to, where these users are and they're kind of dabbling with the problem or using the tool in some way or form. What's your approach to that? Like, what's your approach to like working with the sales team or the marketing team to figure out like what are the right ways to translate that bottoms up to top down?
Anna actually sent me a message very kindly saying some people may not know what top down or bottoms up means when I mention them. So and when you did just then, Apoorv, so I think generally they are what they sound like. Bottoms up in our case is a developer motion where people on the ground, right, are starting to use your tool, and you get into organizations from the bottom up. Top down is, you know, think about what Databricks does now, right? For example, very much, you know, outbound and getting on top of the organization and drilling down from the top down. So having said that, can you remind me what the question was? How to think about that transition, or
how to think about like effectively translating the bottoms up, which is basically building the community, to a top-down motion where you're actually actively exploring prospects across organizations, and some of them are inbound, which is great, but a lot of them are not. And there are certain ways which you might be exploring in your organizations to figure out what those prospects look like based on bottoms-up engagement. So would love to hear your tactics around that.
I love you. I think you need to have departments in your organization working as closely as possible for this. DevRel and community often sits within marketing, for better or for worse, often for worse in all honesty. But I do think having very strong dotted lines to sales is important. And this may be a slight technicality. One of the best ins there, I think, are sales engineers, and sales engineers are going to be some of your best kind of DevRel potential experts as well, right? But I do think it also comes down to what you think your motion will look like, and thinking about the orgs you want to sell into, and who there can block a deal, essentially. So I've worked on products where you definitely need bottom-up buy-in from data professionals, data engineers, machine learning engineers, data scientists. You also need executive support. And you need IT.
Security, yeah.
Absolutely. IT will block you 100 times, right? So making sure that you're aware of how those conversations look, and even as DevRel, creating content for them, collaborating with marketing to even have a one-pager for IT so that they know. You can figure out what most of the checkboxes they need ticked are and just do that, and then have the information to data scientists to share with their IT department if that's the way it works. But, you know, I mean, we commonly refer to this as hand-to-hand combat, right? And there is something like that about it, where you're just in there in the trenches, figuring it out. I think what I've said provides some heuristics around it. It's difficult to say anything concrete without more context around the particular company, but that's my general approach.
There are things I want to add, but I'm also looking at the time, and there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Absolutely.
Do we want to?
Absolutely. Great catch, Anna. And I always run out of time versus questions when I'm talking to both of you. So let's pick up the questions by Ajinkya first. I think his question is that should community building start only after you're confident that you truly have a real problem, or have a better tool? Or have solved a real problem or a better tool, and at the pre-seed stage, so many pivots can happen. And so, like, what should you think about, like, building the community versus like thinking about kind of the right approach to addressing that pain point?
Anna?
I think it's a really good. I'll say something and then you can say something. I would say one thing, which is you don't have to build community in order to leverage community. And so as you're thinking about your pivots, think about what you're trying to learn, help talk to people and have them engaged in conversation, like genuinely get to know what problems people are trying to solve, like talk to them and find out what's on their minds. And you will probably find that some of those people stick around with you as you like go through iterations. Not everyone, but that's okay. You don't have to build community from the get-go. There's lots of community out there.
Great.
I totally agree. And I would build on that by saying, once again, it comes down to what problems you're trying to solve and what your business goals are. So in the case that you're trying to develop your alpha product or beta product or whatever it is, perhaps what you really need at that point is a bunch of people to really brutally test what you're building. And you want a small knit community of a bunch of people who love you or feel really supported by you. Maybe you only need 40 people, in all honesty, at that point, right? Instead of having 1,000 people who are kind of half invested. But I do think, in terms of thinking about potential pivots as well, you do want to leverage, to Anna's point, existing communities. Like if you're building a tool that looks like it's for data scientists, but you may end up pivoting to something for data engineers, the type of effort and bandwidth and resources you need to put into building a community of data scientists may not end up having been worth it if you think you may pivot there.
And we have like one more question, which is, I think, on the choice of channel, I think Discord versus Slack. And I think Samuel also said that he's wondering if GitHub discussion seems to be the ideal trade-off between async, searchability, and easy reach out. Any thoughts on like, what do you think about GitHub discussions, Slack, Discord, any of these channels, and what do you prefer?
I'm smiling and nodding because we're kind of going through this right now with our Slack instance. It's a really good problem to have. Like if you see that there's stuff that's convoluted, that means there's activity, right? That means people are talking. That means people are talking to each other, hopefully. And at a certain scale, it becomes really difficult to support that in a chat platform just because of all of the things that you mentioned. But I don't know exactly what your scale there looks like. I personally prefer Slack as a user and as a community member. I find it easier to scan things. I think it has like better density So it's easier to look at stuff, but that there's also other things you can do. Like you can be on Reddit, you can be on Stack Overflow, you can be doing all sorts of other things. Do people in your community have a GitHub account that is easy for them to, is it easy for them to participate?
I'm just going to chip in here. Yeah, so it's a very developer focused thing. And as a matter of fact, it's very early and the community is not big on Discord, but I'm already bothered by, someone pinged me in a chat and now I have to kind of that obligatory feeling of, I have to reply now, while, I'm wondering kind of instead of building on Discord, just avoid that altogether and just say GitHub discussions or email.
I would say if you had to do one of those two things, do GitHub discussions. If you're developing on GitHub, you can leverage so much. Like if someone asks a question and it's actually like a bug, you can turn it into an issue. You can go file it somewhere else. Like that kind of information organization and being able to follow up with people is really, really cool. But it's also much more searchable than email is, because you kind of want other people to stumble across it and be like, oh yeah, actually I have the same problem.
Exactly. That's my problem with Discord. A lot of people ask the same questions where, and with GitHub, someone asked the first question and other people just find it without bothering everyone else. But yeah, okay, good point.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Hugo.
No, please.
I was just going to say, I'm thinking about this exact problem right now, and we're exploring GitHub discussions for all of these reasons. Yeah.
GitHub also on average is indexed by Google, which is important here. I think depending on bandwidth and how many people you have in your company or project and ability to work on it, Slack is amazing. And anything that is asked several times on Slack, we're actually currently working on a project where we're writing documentation based around Slack conversations and questions, right? So we're actually launching it next week. And so whenever someone asks a question now that we've already answered, we can just link to it essentially. So it's Stack Overflow-esque with particular emphasis on our open source framework, Metaflow. But I do think one word on email sucks for a trillion reasons. I think like we're going to figure out it's going to be like the new cigarettes or something like that at some point. We're all going to realize that it's like one of the worst things we've ever created as a civilization. But maybe that's a bit extreme. But I do think one of the benefits of Slack as well is so many people who work in the data space are on it already, and they open it and they have most of their communication or a great deal of their communication there as well. I think it being somewhat searchable. I mean, there's a joke, right? That Slack is like searchable log of all content and knowledge, but it's not really too searchable. So it should be called LAC, I think. But the fact that it's searchable is incredibly important. And the fact that people log in and can answer each other's questions. You can get a sense of how the community is collaborating within itself. But I think the point I made, that anything that's important that happens on Slack, making sure that goes on the internet as well is incredibly important.
Thank you so much, Anna and Hugo. I know that we've run out of time, but we have so many more questions to go through, and I'm sure like the audience as well. So maybe we'll do a follow-up session to kind of cover all of those things. But thank you so much for joining. I'm sure we all had a lot of fun. But in case anyone wants to reach out to you, like what's the best way to reach out to you in case they have questions or need advice or mentorship or anything?
Well, I mean, I will point everyone to the DBT community Slack, getdbt.com/community. You get a sign up link. I live there pretty much. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
I will point you to the Outerbound Slack. LinkedIn's fine, but I'm actually far more responsive on Slack. And it's slack.outerbounds.co as well.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone. Thank you, joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging out, folks.
Bye.